Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Volume 5 of Akira. Now, Akira is a 6-volume manga series written and illustrated by Katsuhiro Otomo, and the series was published between the years 1982 and 1990, and this particular volume of the series was actually published in 1990. Now, I've already reviewed the first 4 volumes of this series, and you could go check out those reviews if you want. Now, I'm not going to do that whole recap thing because, honestly, there's a lot to recap, so if you're not familiar with this story, just check out my reviews of the first 4 volumes, or better yet, actually read them. Now, if you've seen my reviews of the first 4 volumes of this series, you would know that I'm actually a pretty big fan of this series. And here's the thing, I'm not the biggest, manga person. To be honest, I'm actually kind of a novice when it comes to mangas and anime, but I really dug this series, and I've already read the entire series twice now. And one of the things I love about this series overall is it's just this epic science fiction story. It's this great, dystopian slash post-apocalyptic thriller with elements of the cyberpunk genre. There's even horror elements in this story. There's a lot of different genres at work throughout this entire series, but what really makes this series work is the characters. There's some really rich characterization throughout this entire manga series, and this book is no exception. And this entire story is essentially this epic ensemble piece where you have so many different characters and so many different storylines that do all tie together into the overarching storyline. And one thing I think is really interesting about this particular volume of the series is you see past enemies become friends, and you even see friends become enemies to a certain extent. For example, the character of the Colonel, who in some ways was one of the villains of the first 3 volumes of this series, here you see him actually become a friend and an ally to Kei, despite the fact that these two used to be enemies. Because prior to the destruction of Neo-Tokyo, the Colonel was obviously a part of the Japanese military, and Kei was a part of this terrorist organization that was actively working against the Japanese government and against the Japanese military. So these two were very much enemies in the past, but now you see these 2 former enemies become not just allies, but also friends by the end of this story. But you also see the exact opposite happen with other characters. For example, the character of Ryu, and yes, I know I'm butchering that character's name, but in the previous volume, he developed sort of an uneasy alliance with an American soldier who was sent in by the United States government to take out Akira and Tetsuo, but when Ryu realizes that this soldier is going to go too far and even kill innocent people, the 2 of them sort of become enemies by the end of this. And in this book, you also see the return of Kaneda, who, for the first 3 volumes of this series, was arguably the main protagonist, but he was largely absent throughout most of the events of Volume 4. That was because at the end of Volume 3, when Akira destroyed Neo-Tokyo, Kaneda and a few other people more or less got sucked into sort of another dimension or some weird alternate timeline or something. But basically Kaneda, throughout the events of Volume 4, was not even in our universe, but because of something that happened at the end of Volume 4, Kaneda returns from wherever he was. So in this volume, Kaneda returns, and he becomes an ally to Lady Miyako, and he ends up reuniting with an old friend of his who was a member of the motorcycle gang that both Kaneda and Tetsuo were a part of. And following a failed attack on Lady Miyako's temple from Tetsuo's people, now Tetsuo's people are planning another attack on Lady Miyako. And here you see Kaneda and his old friend join forces with a former enemy, Joker, not to be confused with the Batman character of the same name. This Joker was actually the leader of a gang called the Clowns, who, prior to Akira's attack on Neo Tokyo, were the chief rivals of Kaneda's gang. But here you see Kaneda and Joker become allies, and now they're planning an assault on Tetsuo. And throughout the course of this volume, you realize that Tetsuo is becoming so powerful that he might as well be a god, and he's also starting to lose control of his powers, and because of this, his body is starting to physically change. It turns out that Tetsuo is becoming so powerful that his body can't take it anymore, and essentially he's literally absorbing objects around him to expand his body, and he's more or less transforming into a biomechanical entity. And in this volume, you realize that the United States military is planning an assault on Tetsuo and Akira. And there are also sections of this book that focus on this group of scientists, each from different countries, who are getting together to try to study Akira and Tetsuo. But yeah, Volume 5 of Akira is a badass installment of an already badass series. And there are actually several badass moments in this volume. For example, there are 2 points in the story where Tetsuo attacks this military vessel. Like, at one point, he just walks on the ship without anybody realizing it, and he confronts these scientists, and then the second time, he comes to the ship, and his body is actually becoming fused with the structure of the ship, and essentially the ship is becoming a part of Tetsuo. You also have the moon scene, which people who have read this series already know what I'm talking about. It's one of the most famous scenes from this entire manga. And once again, the characterization in this is superb. Like, this book really does explore the relationship between Kei and the Colonel, who once again used to be enemies. The book also really explores the relationship between Kaneda and Kei, and here you really do see the two start to fall in love with each other. Like, prior to this, Kaneda always had a thing for Kei, but it was more of like a physical attraction. Here you see the two characters genuinely start to fall in love with each other. And even though Kaneda is arguably the main protagonist of this series, this is also very much Kei's story. Like, I would argue that Kei and Kaneda are almost like dual protagonists. And Kei, who's a psychic herself, you realize is very important, and will also be very important in this final battle with Tetsuo, which could very well decide the fate of the human race as we know it. And the book also really does explore the character of Tetsuo, who, even though he is the main villain of this series, he's still a very three-dimensional character. But yeah, I highly recommend Volume 5 of Akira. I mean, I recommend the whole series overall, and obviously I don't recommend this unless you've read the first 4, because this is a very continuity-based series, but once again, I recommend this, and I recommend the whole series. But yeah, that was my review on Akira Volume 5 by Katsuhiro Otomo, and my next book review will be on Akira Volume 6.